Part 1. The bell rang, a loud, ugly sound that meant another day was starting. Kids spilled out of buses and cars, a river of backpacks, and shouted jokes and the slamming of locker doors. In the middle of all that noise, he moved. A boy. Thin, like a sapling that hadn't seen enough sun. His hair was the color of dishwater and fell over his eyes, which were usually pointed at the scuffed toes of his sneakers. Nobody really saw him. He was a ghost in the hallways of Brookfield High. If you asked most kids in his grade to point him out, they'd struggle. They might say, "Oh yeah, the quiet one," but they wouldn't know his name. He was just there. A blur in a gray hoodie, a shadow in the back of the classroom. He had a system, a way to move through the day without causing a ripple. First period, he'd slide into the last seat by the window in history class. He'd unpack his notebook and pen with slow, careful movements, like he was afraid the sound might attract attention. When Mr. Davies asked a question, the boy would shrink, his shoulders curling in, hoping the wall would swallow him. He knew the answers sometimes. You could see it in the slight flicker of his eyes. But his voice stayed locked up tight in his throat. Speaking felt like trying to shout through a mouthful of cotton wool. Between classes was the worst part. The hallways were a jungle of sound and elbows and loud laughter. He'd press himself against the lockers, a piece of driftwood, letting the current rush past him. Conversations washed over him, none of it sticking. "Did you see the game last night?" "Ooh, this test is going to murder me." "Party at Jake's on Saturday, you in?" The words weren't for him. They were for other people, people who belonged. His lunch period was his only quiet victory. While everyone else flooded the cafeteria, a wall of heat and the smell of grease and screaming, he had a different spot. The old library had a nook behind the last bookshelf, a small table hidden from the librarian's desk. He'd eat his sandwich there, the same peanut butter every day, and just breathe. Sometimes he'd read, but mostly he'd just sit, listening to the distant, muffled roar of the school. It was peaceful. It was safe. People didn't mean to be cruel. They just didn't think about him. Once, a girl bumped into him, sending his books flying. "Oh, sorry," she said, already turning to keep walking with her friend. She didn't help pick them up. He just knelt, gathered the pages silently, and moved on. Another time, a teacher, trying to be kind, said loudly in class, "Come on, don't be shy. Share your thoughts with us." The heat that rushed to his face felt like a sunburn. The whole class turned, not with interest, but with a mild, impatient curiosity. He just shook his head, and the moment passed. He became invisible again. What did he do all the time? Where did he go in his head? That was the secret. His world wasn't in that school. It was somewhere else. In his hands, which were often curled into loose fists in his pockets. The fingers were long and slender. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, they would move, tapping a silent, complicated rhythm on his thigh. A rhythm only he could hear. He lived with his grandma in a small, tidy house that always smelled of lemons and old books. His room was at the back. There wasn't much in it. A bed, a desk, a small lamp. But on his wall, taped up with yellowing tape, were sheets of paper. They were covered in lines and dots and symbols that looked like a strange, beautiful language. Musical notation. He didn't have a piano at home. He couldn't. But 3 times a week after school, he'd walk the long way to St. Bartholomew's Church. His grandma cleaned the place on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. She had a key. She'd let him in, give him a tired smile, and say, "1 hour, my love. Don't touch anything else." And she'd go to work with her mop and bucket, the sound of her humming old hymns echoing in the big, empty space dot, and he would walk to the front, to the old, mahogany piano that sat to the left of the altar. It was ancient. Some of the keys were chipped. The middle C had a faint, gray smudge from decades of use. He'd open the fallboard, sit on the hard, polished bench, and for 1 hour, he wasn't the invisible boy. His hands would come alive. They would fly and dance, and whisper, and cry across those keys. He played music from the sheets on his wall pieces, by composers with names like Chopin and Debussy, complicated things full of storms and sunsets and feelings too big for words. He played until his fingers ached and the music filled the hollow of the church, bouncing off the stained glass windows. It was the only time he felt real. It was the only time he felt like he could say everything he needed to say without opening his mouth. Then the hour would end. He'd close the piano lid gently, the sound a soft, final thump. The music would fade into silence, leaving only the smell of wood polish and dust. He'd walk back into the world, the ghost again, the boy in the gray hoodie. The walk home was always quieter, the noise of the school and the town feeling muffled, like he was hearing it from underwater. He carried the echo of the music inside him, a secret treasure, a hidden fire. It kept him warm. It was the reason he could face another day of being nobody. Because in that church, he was somebody. He was a king, a storyteller, a heart beating wildly in the quiet dark. He just had to make it through the daylight hours until he could return to his true self. The Friday assembly was a tradition at Brookfield High, and like a lot of traditions, most kids just went through the motions. It was the last period of the last day of the month, a chance to blow off steam before the weekend. The big hall, with its shiny wood floor and banners for teams nobody remembered, would fill with the scrape of folding chairs and the buzz of a couple hundred teenagers who didn't really want to be there. For the boy in the gray hoodie, it was just another event to survive. He sat, as always, in the very last row, tucked into the corner where the wall met the fire exit door. From there, he could see everyone, but it felt like no one could see him. He kept his head down, tracing the lines on the palm of his hand with a finger, thinking about the walk to the church later. He was working on a new section of a piece, a tricky part where the left hand had to move like flowing water under the melody. He practiced the finger movements on his knee, under the cover of his backpack. On the makeshift stage, the acts came and went. There was a group of guys from the basketball team who attempted a popular rap song. They were more enthusiastic than they were good, but the crowd whooped and clapped along for them anyway. A girl with a confident smile sang a pop ballad with a guitar, her voice clear and strong. People swayed. Then there was a comedy skit by two kids from the drama club that got some genuine laughs, especially when one of them pretended to trip over a microphone wire. The teacher running the show, a cheerful man from the phys ed department, stood off to the side, clapping after each act. Great job. Who's next? Come on, don't be shy. He'd peer out at the sea of students, his clipboard looking mostly empty dot. The boy watched it all from his distant perch. He didn't feel jealous. He didn't feel much of anything about it. This was their world, this showing off, this being seen. His world was private, made of quiet and wooden keys, and the feeling of getting a phrase just right. The noise in the hall felt thick and heavy, a blanket he couldn't push off. He just waited for the clock to tick down. The final act before him was a senior, a guy with a decent voice, who did an okay cover of a song that was all over the radio. He finished with a little flourish, and everyone gave him the standard, polite but ready to leave applause. The phys ed teacher stepped back to the microphone. All right, that was fantastic. We've got about 5 minutes left. Anybody else? One more volunteer? This is your last chance for fame this month. He grinned, scanning the crowd. Anyone at all? Silence. Well, not silence. There was the sound of shuffling feet, a cough, the crinkle of a chip bag someone had smuggled in. A few people looked around, half smiling, hoping someone else would do something to break the awkwardness. No hands went up. A couple of kids in the front rows started to gather their bags, thinking it was over. The teacher's smile became a little strained. No one, really? Don't make me pick someone. A few people laughed nervously. The boy in the back felt a familiar twist in his stomach, a fear of being singled out. He pulled the strings of his hoodie a little tighter, making his world smaller. Then something happened. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a decision he made with his mind. It was a feeling, a physical pull that started deep in his chest. It was like the echo of all those hours in the empty church suddenly got louder than the noise in the hall. It was the memory of the music, his music, which was the only real thing about him. And in that moment, the idea of walking out of this hall, of carrying this secret for another day, for a lifetime, felt worse than the terror of being seen. His body moved before. His brain could catch up and tell him to stop. He uncurled himself from his chair. He stood up. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't say a word. He just stood, a slight figure detaching itself from the shadows of the back wall. At first, nobody noticed. Then a girl a few rows ahead glanced back, maybe hearing the squeak of his chair. She nudged her friend. Their eyes followed his movement. A slow ripple of awareness began to spread, moving from the back rows forward, like a wave. A quiet, confused murmur replaced the shuffling sounds. Asterisk, what's he doing? Asterisk, asterisk, is he leaving? Asterisk, asterisk, no, he's going toward the stage. Asterisk, the phys ed teacher, seeing the movement, squinted into the dim light at the back. Oh, we have a volunteer. Come on down, son. The words felt like a spotlight hitting him. His feet, in their worn sneakers, carried him forward. He walked down the side aisle, not the center, sticking close to the wall. The murmur grew louder. He heard a few stifled giggles, a kind that come from pure bewilderment. He kept his eyes on the scuffed floor, on the legs of the chairs, on the dusty path he was walking. His heart was a frantic bird trapped in his ribs. The air felt too thin. He reached the steps to the stage. They seemed huge. He climbed them, the sound of his own footsteps booming in his ears. The stage lights were warm and bright, a stark, terrifying difference from the shadowy back row. He was completely exposed. Out in the dark sea of the hall, hundreds of faces were turned toward him. He didn't look at them. He had only one destination. Over on the left side of the stage, pushed against the old velvet curtains, was the school piano. It was an upright, painted a dull, chipping black. It was mostly used for the annual holiday concert, and sometimes for drama club rehearsals. It was notoriously old and slightly out of tune. A forgotten thing. He walked toward it. The teacher, looking confused, but still cheerful, said into the mic, "All right. And what's your name, young man?" The boy didn't answer. He couldn't have even if he tried. His voice was gone. He reached the piano. He looked at the bench. For a second, he just stood there, and the whole school seemed to hold its breath. The giggles had stopped. The silence now was heavy, thick with anticipation and confusion. He pulled the bench out. The legs screeched on the wooden stage, a loud, raw sound that made several people jump. He sat down. He adjusted the bench once, twice, getting the distance just right. It was a familiar ritual. His movements, though slow, had a certain practiced certainty to them. He lifted the fallboard, revealing the yellowed keys. He placed his hands in his lap for a moment, his long fingers resting on his knees. He took a slow, deep breath, his eyes closing. In his mind, he wasn't on the stage. He was in the cool quiet of St. Bartholomew's. The smell of lemon polish from his grandma's cleaning was in the air. The only light was the colored glow from a saint in the stained glass window. The only sound was the beating of his own heart, slowing steady out in the hall. Nobody moved. The popular kids in the front rows had stopped texting. The teachers standing along the walls leaned forward, eyebrows raised. The boy who had sung the pop ballad watched, her head tilted. The boy from the basketball team had stopped joking with his friend. They were all waiting. For a train wreck. For a joke. For something. The boy raised his hands. He held them just above the keys, hovering. And then he began to play. The first sound was a single note. It was a low note, deep and soft, like a stone dropped into a still pond. It hung in the air of the silent hall for what felt like forever. Then his other hand moved, and a chord joined it. Not a bright, happy chord from a pop song. This was different. It was complex, a little sad, and full of shadows. It sounded like the memory of a rainy afternoon. A kid in the third row, who had been about to whisper a joke to his friend, closed his mouth. The joke evaporated. He just stared. The boy on the stage was gone. The nervous hunch in his shoulders had melted away. His back was straight, but not stiff. His head was tilted slightly, as if he was listening to something only he could hear. His eyes were still shut tight. His hands, those long, slender fingers that usually fumbled with a pencil or stayed buried in his pockets, had become something else entirely. They were alive. They moved over the keys with a grace that seemed impossible. They weren't hitting the notes. They were touching them, pulling the sound out of the old piano. The music began to weave itself together. It was a melody that twisted and turned, sometimes soaring high and clear, sometimes sinking into something low and troubled. It was beautiful, but it wasn't a simple beauty. It was the kind of beautiful that made your chest feel tight. No one knew what the piece was. Later, a music teacher would identify it as Chopin, a nocturne. But in that moment, it didn't have a name. It was just feeling. It was loneliness given a sound. It was the quiet ache of watching from the outside. It was also a fierce, proud kind of sadness, a strength hidden in the minor keys. The old-school piano, with its slightly tinny tone and one sticky key, didn't matter. Under his hands, it sounded like a grand piano in a concert hall. He worked with its flaws, flowing around the sticky note, making the soft pedals sing. He wasn't just playing notes on a page. He was telling a story. You could hear it. You could hear a question in one phrase, a sigh in the next, a sudden flash of stubborn hope in a run of quick, silvery notes up the high keys. In the audience, the shift was total. The confused stares softened. The smirks disappeared. A girl who was known for never putting her phone down let her hand, holding the phone, drop slowly into her lap. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at him. Her friend next to her had tears welling up in her eyes, and she didn't even know why. A teacher at the side of the hall, a stern-looking man who taught chemistry, felt his arms uncross. He found himself leaning forward, his professional detachment gone. He wasn't thinking about chords or technique. He was thinking about the boy, the quiet one from the back of his class. He'd called on him once or twice, gotten only a mumbled, "I don't know," in return. He'd written him off as disengaged. Now, hearing this, he felt a hot pinch of shame. This wasn't a disengaged kid. This was a kid who had been engaged with a whole universe they knew nothing about. The popular basketball player who had performed earlier sat completely still. His performance, the one that got all the cheers, now felt silly in his memory, just noise and posing. This was real. This was skill that came from some other place, from thousands of hours of alone time. He felt a surprising sense of respect, cutting through his usual confidence. For the boy playing, the world had narrowed to the space between his hands and the keys, and the music in his head. The terrifying crowd was just a dark blur beyond the stage lights. He wasn't performing for them. He was just finally letting something out. This was the music from the church. This was the sound of his walks home, of eating lunch alone, of feeling like a ghost in the hallway. This was all the words he'd never said, pouring out through his fingertips. He played a section where the left hand did a gentle, rocking rhythm, like a heartbeat, while the right hand sang a mournful, singing line above it. A senior in the front, a guy who was usually cracking jokes and planning weekend parties, felt a lump form in his throat. He thought of his grandfather's funeral last year, a feeling he'd pushed down and hadn't talked about. The music went right to that hidden place. Then the music changed. It grew stronger, more urgent. The boy's fingers flew faster, the notes coming in a passionate cascade, like a storm finally breaking. His body moved with it now, just a slight sway from the waist, a firm press of his shoulders. This was the fire. This was the secret king in the empty church. This was the power he had inside him all along. The sound filled every corner of the hall, not loud in a crashing way, but dense, complete, an utterly captivating dot. No one coughed. No one whispered. No one scraped a chair. The only sound was the piano. Hundreds of people were breathing together, caught in the same spell. A janitor who had been pushing a mop in the hallway outside stopped and peeked through the doors. He stood there, leaning on his mop handle, and listened. The boy reached a part he had been practicing all week, the flowing water part he'd been fingering on his knee just minutes before. His left hand danced a complex, rippling pattern, impossibly smooth and even. A girl in the orchestra, who played the violin, shook her head slowly in disbelief. She knew how hard that was. She'd tried piano, to make it sound that effortless, that liquid. It wasn't just practice. It was a kind of magic dot. As quickly as the storm had built, it began to recede. The music softened, returning to the melancholy of the beginning, but it was different now. It was wiser resolved. The final notes came, one after another, slow and clear and perfectly spaced. A gentle, fading chord. A last single note that seemed to shimmer in the air. He lifted his hands. He placed them softly back in his lap. The echo of the last note was swallowed by the quiet. He opened his eyes. He blinked, coming back from that faraway place. For the first time, he really saw the hall. He saw the faces all turned toward him. He saw the complete, utter stillness. A fresh wave of terror washed over him. His old skin of invisibility was gone, ripped away. He was naked on the stage. He braced himself for the laughter, for the boos, for the sound of someone shouting, "What was that?" The silence continued, thick and profound. It lasted 3 seconds, 4. Then, from the middle of the audience, someone started to clap. It was one person, clapping slowly, firmly. It was the girl from the orchestra. She wasn't cheering. It was more like a tribute, a recognition dot. It was the spark. The entire hall erupted. The sound wasn't just applause. It was a physical wave of noise clapping, whistling, shouts of wow, and yeah, and encore. Feet stomped on the floor. The basketball player was on his feet, clapping above his head. The chemistry teacher was nodding, clapping hard. The girl with the phone was cheering, her forgotten device tumbling to the floor. The teachers at the back were beaming. The boy on the stage flinched, the noise hitting him like a wall. He looked out at the roaring crowd, their faces blurry through the bright lights. He didn't smile. He just looked shocked, his eyes wide. He had played his truth, and instead of the rejection he'd always expected, he was met with this storm of sound all for him. He didn't know what to do. So he just sat there, on the piano bench, in the middle of the roaring crowd, completely, and utterly seen. The sound didn't stop. It just changed shape. The roaring applause softened into a steady, thunderous beat of hands clapping together, a rhythm that filled the big hall and seemed to shake the old stage floor. The boy on the piano bench sat frozen, a tiny island in a sea of noise. He had braced himself for laughter, for silence, for anything but this. This was too big. It was a tidal wave of attention coming straight for him, and his whole body wanted to curl up and hide. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat under the crowd's steady rhythm. He stared out, his eyes wide and unblinking against the bright stage lights. The faces were just dark shapes, smudges in the glare, but he could feel every single pair of eyes on him, dot down in the front row. The girl who had sung the pop ballad earlier was standing, clapping so hard her palms were turning red. She wasn't just clapping politely. There was a look of pure astonishment on her face. She kept leaning over to her friend, shouting something over the noise, her mouth forming the words. How did he? Her friend just shook her head, speechless, eyes glued to the stage. That the change started at the back. A few kids in the last rows, the ones who usually slipped out early, weren't heading for the doors. They were standing on their chairs, trying to get a better view. One of them, a tall guy with a skateboard tucked under his arm, took a few steps forward. He wasn't clapping. He just moved, drawn toward the stage like a magnet. He walked slowly down the side aisle, his sneakers quiet on the polished floor. He stopped about 20 feet from the stage, right at the edge, where the light from the stage met the darker audience. He just stood there, looking up. Someone else saw him move. A group of friends near the middle, their initial shock wearing off, began to drift from their seats. They weren't running or pushing. It was a quiet, steady migration. They left their backpacks on their chairs and moved down the aisles, gathering in the open space. Between the first row of seats and the stage dot, it was like watching iron filings pull toward a magnet. A couple near the front got up, then a whole row. A teacher, standing by the wall, didn't try to stop them. She just watched, her hand over her mouth. She took a few steps forward herself. The boy on stage saw the movement. He saw the dark shapes getting closer, pooling in front of him. A fresh jolt of panic shot through him. Were they coming to get him? To make fun of him up close? He gripped the edge of the piano bench, his knuckles white. But their faces, as they came into the light, held no mockery. They held wonder, curiosity, a kind of softness he had never seen directed at him before. They were looking at him, not through him. The popular basketball player who had performed earlier walked right up to the stage. He didn't jump up on it. He just stood at the very base, looking up at the boy. He gave a single firm nod. It wasn't a friendly, hey, nod. It was a nod of respect, the kind one athlete gives another after a hard-fought game. Then he turned and stood there, his arms crossed, as if guarding the space. Now the trickle became a stream. Dozens of students were flowing out of the seating area. They gathered in a half-circle around the piano. They were close enough that he could see their expressions, the raised eyebrows, the small smiles, the eyes that were still a little shiny. They didn't say anything. They just gathered. They filled the space, a silent crowd of people who just 10 minutes ago wouldn't have noticed if he'd vanished into thin air. The clapping began to die down, replaced by a low, buzzing hum of whispers. The sounds were soft, amazed. I had no idea. That was unbelievable. What was that song? The boy heard the whispers like echoes from another room. He was trapped in a glass jar of his own shock. He looked down at his hands, resting in his lap. They were the same hands. They still had the same small scar on the left thumb from where he'd caught it in a church pew years ago. But they felt different. They felt like they belonged to someone else The phys ed teacher with the clipboard finally moved. He walked to the center of the stage, holding up his hands. The crowd's murmur quieted. "Well," the teacher said, his voice sounding strangely thin after the music and the applause. He cleared his throat. I think we've all just witnessed something very special." He turned to look at the boy, his usual cheerful grin replaced by something more serious, more genuine. "Son, that was extraordinary. Thank you." The boy didn't look up. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It wasn't a refusal of the thanks. It was more like he was trying to clear the fog from his brain. "What's the piece called?" The teacher asked gently, taking a step closer. The boy's mouth was dry as dust. He tried to speak, but only a croak came out. He swallowed, tried again. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet, but in the hushed hall, it carried to the front rows. "Nocturne," he whispered. Then, a little stronger, in C-sharp minor, by Chopin. A murmur of recognition went through the teachers and a few students in the crowd. The name meant something. It had weight. The teacher nodded, impressed. "How long have you been playing?" The boy looked at the piano keys. This was easier. This was just a fact. "Since I was 6, he said, his voice gaining a tiny thread of strength. "My grandma, she cleans a church. They have a piano. I practice there." A simple sentence. But in those few words, the whole story seemed to unfold for everyone listening. The lonely hours, the secret world, the dedication that needed no audience. The girl in the orchestra felt a pang in her chest. She practiced in her living room, with her parents sometimes listening. She couldn't imagine having to find a church to get time on an instrument. The bell rang then. The harsh, familiar sound that usually set everyone stampeding for the exits. This time, nobody moved. They all looked at the teacher, then back at the stage. The teacher laughed, a short, surprised sound. "I guess that's our cue. But let's have one more round of applause for an incredible end to our month." And they did. The sound erupted again, warmer now, less shocked and more appreciative. As the clapping went on, the crowd finally began to shift, but slowly. They didn't rush away. They lingered, looking back over their shoulders as they moved toward the aisles. The boy saw his chance. The focus was breaking. The spell was starting to dissolve into the routine of the school day ending. He stood up, his legs feeling wobbly beneath him. He carefully closed the fallboard over the piano keys, the soft thud final punctuation mark. He pushed the bench back under the piano with the same quiet care he had used to pull it out. He turned and walked to the steps at the side of the stage. As he descended, a few people still standing nearby stepped back, giving him space. They didn't try to talk to him. They just watched him pass, their faces still filled with that soft wonder. He walked back up the side aisle, the same path he had taken down. It was completely different. Before, he had been a freakish spectacle walking to his doom. Now, he was walking through a tunnel of silent acknowledgement. People he had shared classes with for years met his eyes and gave him small, shy smiles. A guy from his math class held out a fist for a bump. The boy, after a second of stunned hesitation, lightly touched his own fist to it. He reached the back doors of the hall and pushed them open. The noise of the crowd faded behind him, replaced by the empty, echoing silence of the main hallway. The weekend had started. The school was emptying. He walked to his locker, his movements automatic. He spun the combination, the numbers coming to him without thought. He put his books inside and took out his worn canvas bag. He shut the locker door. The metallic clang was loud in the quiet hall. He stood there for a moment, alone again. He could still feel the vibration of the applause in his bones. He could still see the crowd gathered around him, not as a threat, but as witnesses. He looked down at his hands. They were just his hands again, but everything else felt cracked open, like a shell that had been broken and couldn't be put back together. He slung his bag over his shoulder and started the long walk to St. Bartholomew's. The walk he took every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. But for the first time, he wasn't just carrying his secret to the piano. He was carrying the memory of what happened when he finally let it out. The world outside the school windows looked the same, but he knew, in a way he couldn't fully understand yet, that nothing would ever be the same inside these walls again. The walk to St. Bartholomew's felt longer than usual. His legs were shaky, like he'd just climbed a tall hill. The usual sounds of the town cars passing, a distant lawnmower, kids yelling in a park seemed muffled and far away. It was as if he was hearing them from underwater. The roar of the applause was still ringing in his ears, a phantom noise trapped inside his head. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of the church. The familiar, cool, quiet air washed over him. The smell of old books, wood polish, and faintly of candle wax. It was his world, the real world. The silence here was different from the silence in the hall after he'd finished playing. That had been a stunned, heavy quiet. This was a peaceful, empty one. His grandma was polishing the brass collection plates near the altar. She looked up, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "You're late," she said, not in a scolding way, but with simple fact. Then she paused, squinting at him. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." He just nodded, dropping his bag by the usual pew. "Yeah," he mumbled. It was all he could manage. How could he even start to explain? He walked to the old mahogany piano, his sanctuary. He ran a finger along the smooth, dark wood. It felt more real than anything else just then. He sat down on the hard bench, but didn't open the lid. He just sat there, staring at the grain of the wood, replaying it all in his mind. The walk down the aisle, the screech of the bench, the first note, the sea of faces. The gathering crowd. His grandma watched him for a minute, her polishing cloth going still in her hands. She was a woman of few words, used to his quiet ways. She saw something tremble in his shoulders, a kind of release. She didn't ask any more questions. She just went back to her work. The soft shush-shush of the cloth on brass, a gentle, familiar rhythm in the quiet. Asterisk, 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 Monday morning arrived with a gray sky and a feeling of dread that was entirely new. Before, the dread had been a dull, constant hum, the dread of being unnoticed. Now it was a sharp, prickling fear of being seen. What would they do? Would they point? Would they laugh now, having had the weekend to decide his performance was weird? Would it all go back to the way it was, only worse because he'd broken the rule of staying invisible? He put on the same gray hoodie. It felt like armor now. He walked to school, his stomach in knots. The first thing he noticed was the space around him. In the hallway, as he went to his locker, kids didn't just part around him like water around a stone. They made room. A guy from his history class walking past gave him a short, quick nod. "Hey," the guy said, and kept walking. Just hey. A simple, one-syllable word he'd never heard directed at him before. He flinched, his head ducking automatically. But the guy was already gone. It wasn't a trick. He got to his first period history class. He hesitated at the door, his old instincts screaming at him to slip into the back row unseen. But when he walked in, a few heads turned. Not stares of mockery, but looks of recognition. The girl who sat in front of the back row, the one who always had her notes perfectly organized, glanced back and offered a small, shy smile. She moved her bag off the empty seat next to her, just an inch. An invitation. He froze, then took his usual seat in the very back by the window. But the gesture sat with him. Warm and confusing. Mr. Davies, the history teacher, was taking attendance. He called out names, students mumbling here or present. He got to the boy's name. Before the boy could whisper his usual, almost silent reply, Mr. Davies looked up from his list. He looked right at him, his eyes different. Not impatient, but thoughtful. "Here," the boy said, his voice a little clearer than before. Mr. Davies didn't just check the box. He nodded. "Good to see you," he said. Then he added, almost to himself, "Chopin. A formidable choice." He went on to the next name. The boy felt his face grow warm. The teacher knew, and he hadn't made a big show of it. He just acknowledged it. At lunchtime, the old panic set in. The cafeteria was its usual roaring self. He stood at the entrance, his tray in hand, the noise washing over him. His feet automatically began to carry him toward the library, toward his hidden nook. It was safe. "You could sit here, if you want." The voice came from his left. It was the boy from the basketball team, the one who had performed the rap song. He was sitting with 3 of his friends at a table near the window. There was an empty chair. They were all looking at him, not with challenge, but with a kind of open curiosity. The boy with the tray felt the world tilt. This was the center. This was a table where people laughed loud and everyone looked. His mouth went dry. He shook his head, a quick, jerky movement. I have to go," he stammered. The basketball player just shrugged easy. "Cool, another time." And they went back to their conversation. He fled to the library, his heart pounding. But the meaning of the offer echoed in the quiet of his book nook. He hadn't been mocked. He'd been asked. The world hadn't snapped back to the old way. It had changed, and he didn't know the rules of this new place. The real test came after school. The phys ed teacher found him at his locker. "There you are," the teacher said, smiling. "The music teacher wants to see you. If you have a minute." The walk to the music wing felt like walking to the principal's office. The music room was full of stands and chairs and the smell of rosin. The music teacher, a woman with kind eyes and a conductor's sharp posture, was waiting. "Come in," she said. "Close the door." She didn't sit behind her desk. She leaned against a piano, a nicer one than the one in the hall. "Friday was a gift to this school," she said simply. "What you have is a rare thing. Not just the technique, though that's clearly years of hard work. It's the feeling you put into it." He stared at the floor, unsure what to do with the words. "I have a proposal," she continued. "The state solo competition is in 2 months. I think you should enter. I would work with you. We could use the piano in here after school." She paused. "You wouldn't have to play in another assembly. This would just be for you, and for the judges. A competition. Playing on purpose, for people who were judging." The thought was terrifying. But so was the idea of going back to only playing in an empty church, now that he knew what it was like to share the music. The secret was out. It wasn't just his anymore. He gave a slow, uncertain nod. "Good," she said, her smile reaching her eyes. "We start Wednesday." He left the music wing in a daze. As he walked down the main hall toward the exit, he passed the open doors of the big hall. He stopped. The stage was empty. The old black piano sat in the wing, quiet and forgotten again. He didn't go in. He just looked at it from the doorway. That piano was just a thing, an out-of-tune school instrument. But for 5 minutes on a Friday, it had been a bridge. It had carried the music from the silent church inside him out into the noisy, messy world. And the world, to his endless shock, had listened. He walked out of the school. The gray hoodie was still the same. His sneakers were still scuffed. He was still the boy who loved the quiet and the safety of shadows. But he was also the boy who had played the nocturne. The two parts of him, the invisible and the seen, had crashed together. They weren't separate anymore. He wasn't sure how to be this new whole person, but for the first time, the walk home didn't feel like an escape. It just felt like a walk home. The air seemed clearer. The weight he'd carried for so long, the weight of being a secret, was gone. In its place was something lighter and more frightening, and full of a strange, quiet possibility. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was just a boy, walking home with music still humming softly inside him, waiting for the next note.